Sign the papers or walk away with absolutely nothing. My husband spat across the candlelit table, slamming a thick stack of divorce documents right into my salad plate. Sitting right next to him, his smug new girlfriend smirked, sneering that I was just a penniless, weak stay-at-home wife who had outlived her usefulness. They were expecting tears, a screaming scene, or me getting down on my knees to beg. But I didn't flinch. I just calmly pushed the documents back toward him. Before he could scream at me again, the heavy oak doors of the high-end steakhouse swung open. The billionaire owner of the entire company my husband worked for walked straight up to our table. He ignored my pale, trembling husband completely, bowed his head to me with profound respect, and placed a heavy silver set of keys directly into my hand. My name is Scarlett, and at 28 years old, I thought I was walking into a celebratory 6th anniversary dinner. I had spent the afternoon picking out a dress, assuming my husband Derek had reserved our favorite table at Le Petit Chateau's to mark how far we had come. But as the maitre d' led me toward the private back dining area, the romantic evening I had envisioned vanished into thin air. Sitting at the secluded booth was Derek, looking impeccably groomed in a custom blazer, but he wasn't alone. Next to him sat Chloe, his younger, notoriously arrogant marketing assistant, clad in a silk red dress and wearing a triumphant smirk. Before I could even reach the table, Derek didn't offer a greeting or an explanation. Instead, he pulled a heavy manila folder from his leather briefcase and slammed it squarely down on the white tablecloth next to my bread plate. "Sit down, Scarlett. We need to handle this right now," he demanded, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. I quietly took my seat, watching as Chloe leaned into his shoulder, her eyes cold with disdain. "Sign the papers, Scarlett," Derek spat, sliding a pen across the table. "I'm filing for an immediate divorce. You get no alimony, no property rights, and no settlement. You're walking away with what you came with, which is nothing." Chloe giggled softly, resting her chin on her hand. "Let's be real, Scarlett," she chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. "You're just a penniless, useless stay-at-home wife who's been riding Derek's executive success for years. He's a rising star at Sterling Enterprises and you're just holding him back." I sat in complete silence. My chest didn't heave, my hands didn't tremble, and not a single tear fell. I simply looked at the two of them, keeping my expression entirely calm, letting the heavy silence stretch between us until Derek's confident smirk began to waver. Derek watched me expectantly, mistaking my quiet silence for total submission. He had no idea that as I looked at his smug face, my mind was rewinding 6 years, back to when we were fresh-faced newlyweds living in a cramped, drafty studio apartment that smelled like damp paint and cheap takeout. We were so broke back then that we had to count quarters just to run a single load of laundry at the laundromat down the street. What Derek never truly understood, or chose to forget, was the immense sacrifice I made to pull us out of that hole. Fresh out of university, I had been a brilliant, top-of-my-class structural engineer with a promising, highly lucrative corporate career lined up. But when Derek's ambitious dreams stalled and his confidence faltered, I stepped back into the shadows. I quietly set aside my own professional ambitions to manage our entire household, handling every bill, scheduling every meeting, and insulating him from life's harsh realities so he could focus entirely on climbing the corporate ladder. Even deeper than my career sacrifice was a secret I had guarded fiercely to protect his fragile male ego. When my late father passed away, he left me a substantial private estate trust. Rather than flaunting it, I used those hidden financial reserves to quietly bankroll Derek's life. I secretly paid off his massive student loans, funded his tailored suits, financed his executive networking events, and made sure our bank accounts always looked healthy enough for him to project an image of effortless wealth. When Derek recently landed a senior executive promotion at Sterling Enterprises, the inflated title completely warped his reality. He convinced himself that he was a self-made prodigy who had single-handedly conquered the corporate world. He began treating me not as the partner who had built his foundation, but as an embarrassing artifact of his humble past, a penniless housewife he was now too important to be tied down to. Chloe let out a condescending chuckle, swirling her wine glass as she pointed at the pen on the table. "Don't just stare at it, Scarlett. Sign it so Derek can finally enjoy the life he deserves without your dead weight dragging him down." Before I could even respond, the atmospheric chatter of the high-end restaurant suddenly vanished. Heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed across the marble floor as the grand oak doors of the dining room swung open. Walking through the doorway was Arthur Sterling, the elusive billionaire chairman and founder of Sterling Enterprises, flanked by two towering corporate security detail officers. Arthur was a legend in the business world, a man who rarely appeared in public and governed his billion-dollar empire with absolute precision. Derek's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. A smug, delusional grin immediately spread across his face as he adjusted his tie and stood up, puffing out his chest to impress Chloe. "Unbelievable," Derek whispered loudly, casting one last belittling glare in my direction. "Mr. Sterling himself must have tracked me down here to personally congratulate me on the Q3 quarter numbers. Watch and learn, Scarlett. This is what real power looks like." Derek took 2 eager steps forward, holding out his hand with an obsequious smile. "Mr. Sterling. What an absolute honor, sir." Arthur Sterling didn't even slow down. He brushed past Derek's outstretched hand as if he were entirely invisible, walking directly past him toward our booth. The room seemed to freeze as Arthur stopped right in front of me. To the complete horror of Derek and Chloe, the powerful chairman bowed his head slightly in profound respect. "Good evening, Miss Scarlett," Arthur said, his deep voice carrying through the silent restaurant. "My apologies for the slight delay. Everything has been prepared as you instructed." Without another word, Arthur reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek leather folder along with a heavy, polished silver set of master keys, placing them directly into my waiting hands. Derek stood frozen in place, his hands still awkwardly suspended in midair, his face draining of all color. Mr. Sterling?" he stammered, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "I think there's been a massive misunderstanding. That's just my wife, Scarlett. She doesn't work for the company. She's just a stay-at-home housewife." Arthur turned slowly, fixing Derek with an icy, razor-sharp gaze that made the room temperature drop. "She is not just your wife, Derek," Arthur said, his voice echoing clearly across the restaurant. "She is the primary investor, founding partner, and silent 51% majority owner of Sterling Enterprises." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Chloe dropped her wine glass, sending red liquid splashing across her silk dress, but she didn't even move to clean it up. She just stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Arthur looked back at me, nodding respectfully as he explained for the room. 7 years ago, when Sterling Enterprises was on the brink of total bankruptcy and every bank turned us away, it was Scarlett's late father's estate trust and her personal engineering foresight that injected millions into our venture. Without her capital and strategic mind, this company would not exist today. You don't work for me, Derek. You have been working for her all along. Derek's breathing turned fast and shallow as horror washed over him. The master silver keys lying on the table right in front of me weren't for a house or a car. They were the physical keys to the corporate headquarters, giving me total operational access to every facility, office, and financial ledger in the empire. Every insult Derek had hurled, every piece of arrogance he had displayed, and the cold divorce papers sitting on the table suddenly transformed from a victory parade into his absolute undoing. He stumbled backward into his chair, looking at me as if he were seeing a ghost, realizing he had just tried to ruin the woman who held his entire life in her hands. Arthur turned his attention back to Derek, his expression hardening into stone. "Effective immediately, Derek, your employment at Sterling Enterprises is terminated. Your corporate accounts are frozen and your access badges have been revoked." Derek scrambled out of his chair, grabbing Arthur's arm in sheer desperation. "Mr. Sterling, please. You can't do this. This is a personal matter. I've brought millions in revenue to your firm." "You didn't bring revenue to my firm," Arthur replied coldly, shaking off Derek's grip. "You misused company assets and violated our core ethical conduct policies by attempting to leverage corporate influence for personal extortion. Security, escort them out." The 2 imposing security officers stepped forward, seizing Derek by his arms as he began to scream and thrash. Chloe let out a horrified gasp, scrambling to grab her designer handbag as the guards marched them both backward toward the exit. The entire dining room sat in stunned silence, patrons turning to watch the high-flying executive and his mistress being forcibly ejected from the high-end establishment like common trespassers. Once the oak doors slammed shut behind them, the silence returned to the table. I picked up the thick stack of divorce documents Derek had slammed down so triumphantly just minutes earlier. Slowly, methodically, I tore the papers straight down the middle. I stacked the halves together and tore them again, letting the shredded pieces rain quietly down onto the tablecloth. "I won't be signing your terms, Derek," I whispered to the empty chair, my voice calm, steady, and resolute. "When we dissolve this marriage, it will be on my terms with my legal team, and you will leave with exactly what you brought into it. Absolutely nothing." The morning after the confrontation at the restaurant, I walked through the front doors of Sterling Enterprises as its majority owner for the very first time. I immediately authorized a team of senior forensic accountants to conduct a deep, comprehensive audit of Derek's department. What they uncovered was far worse than poor judgment. Derek had spent the past 14 months embezzling corporate funds, cooking the books to finance luxury trips, designer jewelry, and a down payment on a plush high-rise condo for Chloe. Armed with definitive proof of corporate fraud, our legal counsel moved swiftly. We filed civil suits to recoup every stolen penny and handed the forensic evidence directly to law enforcement for criminal prosecution. Within weeks, Derek's personal bank accounts were frozen, his credit cards were cancelled, and his luxury vehicle was repossessed. Faced with astronomical legal fees and impending criminal indictment, his artificial empire collapsed into total bankruptcy. Predictably, the moment the money dried up and criminal charges loomed, Chloe abandoned him without a second thought. She blocked his number, moved out of the condo, and left him to face the consequences alone. While Derek's life spiraled, I stepped out of the background and took an active seat as executive chair of the board. Using my structural engineering background and sharp financial oversight, I restructured the company's operations, closed financial loopholes, and redirected capital into high-growth projects. The executive board, initially surprised by my sudden emergence, quickly recognized my competence and strategic vision. Under my direct leadership, corporate revenue rose sharply, earning me the unanimous trust and deep respect of the entire company. Standing in my top-floor corner office, looking out over the city skyline, I barely recognized the woman who used to sit quietly at home, dimming her own light just to keep someone else's fragile ego afloat. The divorce was finalized months ago entirely on my terms. Derek left the court with nothing but a mountain of debt, a shattered reputation, and a pending court date, while I walked away with my dignity, my assets, and my independence fully intact. Life after Derek is quiet, productive, and wonderfully free from deceit. Under my active direction, Sterling Enterprises has expanded into new markets, breaking performance records quarter after quarter. I no longer hide behind non-disclosure agreements or silent trust accounts. I lead openly, surrounding myself with people who value integrity, competence, and genuine loyalty. Looking back at that night in the restaurant, I realized that being underestimated was actually my greatest advantage. People often mistake patience for weakness and quiet composure for powerlessness. But true strength doesn't need to shout, make threats, or demand attention in a crowded room. True power sits quietly, observes, and lets the truth do the work. I didn't lose anything when Derek demanded a divorce. I simply shed the dead weight that was keeping me from stepping into my own greatness.